once again, I mean, I love this stage. We have always super interesting people. And our next speaker is also someone incredibly important in our ecosystem, specifically in Europe. So previous to his political stunt, he was co-founder and managing partner of a venture fund. So he knows one or two things about investing. After that, he got into politics, becoming the Secretary of State to the Prime Minister of Portugal. And currently, he holds the position of EU Commissioner for Research, Science and Innovation since November 2014. So here to talk about how to build innovative ecosystems, please welcome Carlos Moedas.
Yeah. Oh, does it work? Yeah, thank you so much. It's quite late in the afternoon, and I'd like to thank you for being here still to listen to me, to a politician. And I thought that today what I really would like to do was to talk to you about change and the fact that people are so afraid of change. And because of that, we're living in such a moment that I feel the world is so dangerous. And we need your help. Politicians need your help. And I've been in your place, and I know that I probably didn't help as I should. And so my point to other politicians is that the only way that you can deal with change is through innovation. And innovation is a major part of how to deal properly with change, because if not, you're too afraid. And when you look back, you think, but why is the world closing itself? Why do people want to close borders? Why do people want actually to be in their own country with their borders and their people, and they don't want any kind of change? And you look at the world, and it's good when you do the exercise of looking when the world was really open. And one of the parts of history that I really like is the period that comes 50 years before 1914. The period before the First World War. And when you look at that period, you see that the world was open. It was so open that a professor at Harvard called Jeffrey Frieden made a study that actually shows that the world today is not as open as the world was in before 1914. And that shows me something, that what happened, what was the reason for that. And when you look at the world before 1914, you see two things that were quite astonishing. One is that there was kind of a global common currency. It was the gold standard. There was just two countries in the world that didn't have any kind or a different set that was not the gold standard. It was China and Persia at the time. And the second one is that people at the time used to travel without a passport. You know, Jeffrey Frieden tells that when people would go as immigrants and they'll get to Ellis Island in New York, they had no papers. They just had three questions actually to answer. The first was, do you have any kind of contagious disease? The second one is like, are you mentally sane? And the third one, are you an anarchist or not? You know? And then, if you would answer these questions, you could get in. And that was before 1914. And then it came 1914, it came the war, the First World War, and what happened? The real GDP went down by 14%. 14%. And it's very interesting because after the First World War, people thought, but let's open again. Let's do again a world that is open. Because we saw the result. The result of protectionism was that the GDP of the world came down. And so they decided to do this conference in Paris in 1920 that was the Passport Conference in Paris, where the main idea of governments, imagine that, was to abolish passports. It didn't happen. And the Second World War came. More protectionism, more closing borders, more being in your own corner, and the real GDP of the world came down by another 22%. And if you look, it's just after the Second World War, from 1950 to the year 2000, about the year 2000, where you see that the exports as a percentage of GDP goes from 8% in 1950 to 20% in the year 2000. That's creating wealth. That's good for the people. That's what you do. But it's also interesting to look at that period, to look at the future, and think about the digital world. Because I think that the period of openness of the world was so good that it was exactly there in those 50, 60 years before that the idea of the digital world came about. And that's one of the most beautiful stories that I really like, that came from Walter Isaacson, one of the best biographers of the world. I mean, he wrote the biography of Kissinger, of Steve Jobs, and he tells the story of those 50 years through the lenses of a woman that was actually the daughter of Lord Byron. She was called Ada Lovelace. And Ada Lovelace, it was a very unique person because she was the daughter of a poet and a writer. But the mother, because the mother didn't like the father, they were divorced, the mother said, look, you cannot study any more of poetry or humanities. You should be a mathematician. And so Ada became a great mathematician. It was so good that she became the first computer programmer of the world. She computed what you call in engineering the Bernoulli numbers. But the big lesson is that the person that she was working with, Charles Babbage, a great mathematician, he just thought that as a computer program for numbers. And at some point, Ada looks at him and says, and I'll quote, you know, Charles, the engine might compose one day elaborated and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity. So in the 1800s, this woman in an open world was defining the digital economy. She was basically having this great idea. And I think what Walter Isaacson doesn't probably tell us is that she was defining what I think is the characteristic that defines a big innovator in the digital age to the one that is not a great innovator. Is that she was telling us that to be a great innovator in the digital world, you need to be at the intersections of disciplines. And she was that. She was at the intersection in between arts and sciences. And that, for me, is the main driver for all of you sitting here today. And that's my job as a European commissioner. What can I do for that? And so I thought to myself that there's just two things I can do. Two things that I think are crucial for Europe. One is basically about how do you build self-confidence. Because self-confidence is the only way that people can be at the intersections. If you're not self-confident, you'll stay at the core of your discipline. You just work on the core of what you know because you're too afraid to be in the intersections. And so the point is that how can you do that? And a professor at mine at Harvard used to say that self-confidence is a sweet point in between ignorance and arrogance. You know, it's like you have to find the right spot. If you have too much, you're an arrogant, and that's bad. If you don't have enough, you're an ignorant, which is also not good. And for that, you have to give the right conditions to innovators. You don't have to tell innovators what to do. They have to tell you what they want to do. You have to be able to listen to them. And that's probably the easiest part, because I think self-confidence somehow is a little bit like in sports. You just do it and do it and do it and do it, and you train and you train and you talk, and at some point you talk nicely. And that's about that. You can train that. But there's one thing you cannot train, and that's one thing that Europe has a lot, which is diversity. Today, you know that to get into digital innovation, you need diversity. And we did studies, scientific studies, that show that scientists that work in diverse environments produce 20% more than others. We know that boards of directors that are diverse, with people that think in a different way, different religions, different parts of the world, work better. And so the point is that today, without that diversity and conflict, you don't have innovation. So you have to create the right tools to have in your company, in your startup, ways of doing what we call creative abrasion. How do you put ideas together, really in conflict, but not in a chaos? And that's, for me, the big thing about the entrepreneur of the future, because he's someone that understands that the way to innovate is not about consensus, it's not about politics. I mean, politicians, we do a lot of consensus. It's not about innovation. Innovation is about that conflict. And so how can you help those that are actually the future on creating those types of environment? And so my job at the end of the day, it's not more than that. It's to lower barriers in terms of regulation that impairs you to do things. It's actually to get the right amount of money at the right place, and people to, like you, find it useful. But I think that the message that I wanted really to leave you here, and I know that I'm going over time, is that be confident in Europe, because Europe is the only place in the world that you find this kind of diversity that actually can get you to the next level. And our job is actually to lower the barriers in between the countries for that to work. Isn't it easy? Should be very easy. Unfortunately, it's not. But that's a big part of my job. But I leave you just with a quote from Walter Isaacson that I love about everything we talked here today. When he finishes his book, The Innovators, he says, "This innovation will come from people who are able to link beauty to engineering, humanity to technology, and poetry to processors. It will come from creators who can flourish, where the arts intersect with sciences, and who have a rebellious sense of wonder that opens them to the beauty of both." Finally,
well, we can get some questions if you want.
If you have questions. If not,
anyone has any questions?
Have a drink.
For Carlos. We have one here. No? Sure? Any questions over there? There we go.
Hello.
You stay with me.
I'll stay with you, don't worry.
It's great to hear that you put such emphasis on diversity. So I would be very interested to learn a little bit more on what are the specific tools or initiatives that you currently have in place to foster more diversity, mainly talking about innovation and startups. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Look, what we do, I think, is that first you have to push. And so one of the things we do in terms of gender balance is that we always have a rule that we need at least 40% to 50% of women in our advisory boards in Europe. And that is a rule that I think is extremely important because it actually pushes something that is not natural, that doesn't happen in most of the countries. And it's very interesting when we have meetings that we have a lot of people coming from all these countries. There's something that in diversity is crucial, is that those groups where you see diversity of gender and different countries, they normally take a little bit more time to work. So you have to give them more time. And it's kind of binary. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but you have to have the time to let the group get it on with business and have the patience. And so I think that one of the things is sometimes people don't want diversity because they don't have the patience to wait. But then when it works, you see wonders. You see how beautiful it is to have people with so different ideas and creating something common. So it's a little bit, you have to be in between creating the rules, but at the same time pushing people to be together, even if when they don't want to be together, because they think differently. It's much more comfortable for us to have people that think like us. So these are the kind of very simple things that we do in Europe.
Now a question? Somebody at the back? We have another one over there.
Hello. Okay, it works. I just have a question. You were saying that there are quite a lot of barriers within Europe for people to come together and form startups. And you stressed a lot in your speech diversity. And I was wondering, do you think the major problem is to do with the fact that there are certain European countries that are taking like more of a strongman position. So there's more of a hierarchy within Europe. Instead of it being intergovernmental, it seems like there's one country that's sort of leading in this supranational structure. So my question is, how do we overcome that? And as you were saying, it's your job to encourage diversity and integration. So how do we get to that before we can truly become a place for startups? Thank you.
You know, I think that your point, and politically, of course, there's the big countries and the small countries. But in terms of science, I don't see that much in science and innovation, because what you see is that that divide does not exist geographically anymore. When you go to the best of the best companies or the best universities in Europe, you see people from around the world. And when I go, for instance, to a British university, I mean, we could talk a little bit about Brexit. You go to a British university where most of the people, I was just at the Imperial College 2 weeks ago, and 1,000 of the teachers and the staff are actually non-British. They are European citizens from other parts. So I think that it's true that that divide north, south, east, west is one of the reasons that sometimes you feel in Europe that you can't get things done. But it's because it takes time. You know, when you look at it, I mean, these 70 years of peace and prosperity that we had is because of the European project. Before that was the war. So it's not that before that was a great time. And so it takes a long time. You know, I mean, I think that when you look at the Anglo-Saxon system, you have a system where you are kind of bottom up. So you have a problem, you work the problem, you go up the ladder, and at some point the political system announces a solution. In the European project, it's the other way around. It's kind of top down. You come at really, you get people around, you get consensus, you get 28 around the table to actually get finally to a solution, and then you tell to the people. And so it creates confusion. And so I think that it's really about us Europeans to one think, what's the alternative, which I think is awful, and what's the price that you have to pay, because you have a supranational entity, but you don't have a government of Europe. You have a system that makes everybody work together. And I think that the price of actually sometimes you get all these layers of decision making, it's a kind of a small price for what you get out of there. And I don't think that your generation will ever accept that you'll have to show passports again, that you'll have to go through borders, that I mean, that is not even in your dreams. I mean, you cannot imagine a Europe that is different from the one that we have now. And that gives me a lot of hope, because I see a lot of people from the older generation, they think that the world before was better. And for you, I think that you're not as involved in politics because you think that it's irreversible. My message to you is that, look, I really hope it's not irreversible, but I need your help. I need that people like you tell me, look, I have a startup. I want the startup to be all over Europe. I don't want to have a startup that I have to build 28 different startups. I want less barriers. I want more Europe, because if not, I cannot do my business. But you're so far apart from the political reality because you're doing your own life, you're doing your own businesses, that you don't get involved. And I think it's time for the community of innovators and startuppers to get a little bit more involved, because at some time or at some point, you will pay the price. You will pay the price.
I think that's a fantastic closing remark, because as a startup person myself, I think we need to get more involved and help you guys make a better future for everyone. So that's our last question. Please, thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much, Carlos. Big pleasure having you on stage.